So the Hungary-Ukraine episode was dramatic, but it wasn't the only one that took place yesterday. Two other countries have been trying to join the European Union, and they made some headway too: Moldova and Georgia. And this is very important because both these countries are former Soviet states, Moldova and Georgia, and both are now looking to embrace the EU. Moldova applied last year at the same time as Ukraine, and Georgia followed soon after. Now, Georgia is a small country with less than 4 million people, located at the border of Asia and Europe between the Caucasian mountains and the Black Sea. Georgia also borders Russia. In fact, like I said, it's a former Soviet state. Also the birthplace of one of its most famous leaders, one of the most famous Soviet leaders, Joseph Stalin. He was born in Georgia. So this was a communist stronghold. But yesterday, it became an EU candidate. And that is quite a shift in political affiliation.
With great pride and great joy, I congratulate you on the historic decision. Georgia has become a candidate country for EU membership. Congratulations to all. I want to congratulate every citizen on today's historic day. This is truly a victory for our country and our people.
Georgia's Prime Minister called it a victory. It is a defining moment when a former Soviet nation gets the EU nod. And Georgia's candidature did not come easy. Their president was quite blunt about this.
We, Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova, are the examples of what it means to fight for freedom, to fight for Europe, for those common values that we share with Europe and stay true to them. And this is what we are celebrating today. The sped up process and the events taking place in Brussels today would not have happened without the fight and the devotion of the Ukrainian people and the cruel war that has been raging for almost 2 years now. For this, we need to express our deepest gratitude.
She says Georgia would not have become an EU candidate had it not been for the Ukraine war. And she has a point. In many ways, Georgia was the first Ukraine. It started pivoting towards the West in the early 2000s. In 2006, Georgia worked out a deal with the EU, an action plan to move closer to the bloc. And then in 2008, Georgia began cozying up to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Russia's sworn enemy. Georgia wanted to join both the EU and NATO, the Western Economic Group and the Western Military Bloc. It was a clear rejection of its past. Moscow did not like it. So in 2008, Russia struck Georgia. It began a war over a breakaway region, a region that is internationally recognized as a part of Georgia. But it has been de facto independent since the 1990s, and Russian troops have been present there for decades, acting as peacekeepers. So in 2008, when Georgia showed interest in joining NATO, suddenly, tensions flared up in this province. Fighting broke out, and Russia sent its forces into battle. Does that sound like coincidence? Well, Russia directly engaged in war against Georgia, and that put an end to Georgia's plans to joining NATO. Because NATO says an attack on one member is an attack on all, so they don't really want new members who are already fighting wars, especially against Russia. That meant Georgia's NATO ambitions were dashed. Moscow's play prevented a NATO country cropping up at its border. Does all of this sound familiar? It should, because this is how the Ukraine war started. Ukraine wanted to join NATO and the EU, and that's where a war with Russia began. But this time, the West acted differently. They did not abandon Kiev, they threw it a lifeline. And even though NATO membership seems far off, Ukraine is now closer to joining the EU, and with it, Moldova and Georgia. It's not a done deal yet. And EU candidate status is only the first step. Countries need to change their laws, change their systems to conform with EU guidelines. It could take years. Plenty of time for Russia to make counter moves. In fact, it might already be making some. Reports say Russia is setting up a new naval base in one of Georgia's want-away regions. So Moscow still has some tricks up its sleeve, though losing ground in 3 former Soviet states is a setback.